Thank you, Carl, and thank you all for being here today. This is such an important time to gather. As you all know, this moment is one of risk to so many vulnerable populations, and no more so than immigrants in this country and in our local community. And we are here today to hear stories from members of our community, both the Bethel community and our local Metro West community. We are blessed to hear from one another, to hear singing from Shirel, and to hear from folks from Casa, who we've partnered with now for years. And do stick around to the end, because as we know, in times like this, it's so important to hear stories, to be able to hear song and participate in song, and from stories and learning from each other, to then be able to launch into action. And there's nothing like taking action to fight the malaise that we can feel when we face the chaos that we're encountering now in our country, in our community. So definitely stick around to the end to hear from the folks from Casa. They are such a source of strength and action, effective action. We will learn from them how to move forward in a way that's so constructive. So we're very indebted to all of the enabling that they'll provide to us. Without any further ado, let me introduce to you our first storyteller, poem sharer, in this case, Linda Hirsch.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone, for showing up today. It's a busy, very cold time of year. And today we hope to warm your hearts with beautiful stories. So I'm going to read a poem. Some of you may have heard this already, but it's particularly appropriate for today's activity and the coming days, months, and years. It's called, and I did write this is my poem, Prayer Poem, Human Kindness. In a world where doves of peace fly through broken barricades, over fragile landscapes of the soul, let us whisper of hope. In a world where dreams of freedom live in prisoners, battered, bruised, then freed to rule the hungry masses, let us read of truth. When I pause, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. In a world where dry-eyed children stand seared by visions of apocalypse, pounded by the rhythm of bombs, let us sing of sanity. In a world where ghost-like videos flicker over filthy streets and bloated bellies, float on tears of milkless mothers, let us stop aid to ruling tyrants. In a world where hope hangs in the balance between promises and realities, let us lift the blindfolds of indifference and look for ways to help. In a world where people in distress drift divided like the continents afloat, let us act, let us all act to fill a need, heal a broken spirit, and in the healing, make whole our human kindness. That's the poem. It's embedded in a photo montage that some of you may have seen displayed earlier in the year, last year. Hands that were clenching, fighting, grasping, reaching. This is about connection, and today, thank you. This is about connection and acting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. And next, Diana Tobin.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm so honored to be your first storyteller. The title of my story is Who Isn't a Stranger? And my intention for sharing the story is to tell you why I love strangers and to hope that you find your reasons and that you can also share them in your own story. So I want to do a land acknowledgement that we are all one tribe and we live on earth. And I don't know if you know this song, but I remembered this. It goes perfectly for today. Passing through, sometimes lonely, sometimes blue. We're all strangers and we're only passing through. I saw Adam leave the garden with an apple in his hand. I said, now you're out, what are you gonna do? He said, grow some crops and pray for rain, maybe raise a little cane. We're all orphans and we're only passing through. And you can join me, I'm gonna sing it just a little bit more. Passing through, sometimes lonely, sometimes blue. We're all orphans and we're only passing through. Thank you. So June 2024, 2024, I joined the Sanctuary Committee here at Bethel. And I found out, I don't know if you know this, but the committee has been meeting for 40 years and doing good work for 40 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more. And what it is it's not about eggs. It's not about the price of eggs. I wrote this earlier, so it doesn't have to do with this week. But it's not about the price of eggs. And it's not about the climate disruption that's causing climate refugees. It's about a lot more than that. A lot more, because we're all connected. So 1965, I was in junior high or high school. Not a happy camper. I did not like school because I had learning disabilities, and people then didn't know what a learning disability even was. So it was hard to learn. And when kids were socializing or having a good time, I was struggling with my math papers and just basic stuff. And, you know, I remember my days in high school, but I felt like a stranger. I didn't really have friends, and I didn't really have, I just didn't have a social group. I probably had a social difficulty, and I didn't have time to socialize. I had to get my paperwork done. So I felt like a stranger in my school, in my community, which was a little suburb with nothing to do, just a school and an activity center. And I even felt like a stranger at home. 1955. That's when we moved. I lived in Boston. I lived in Dorchester. I loved being in Boston. It was so exciting. And There weren't any backyards or front yards, but when we got out of our house, we could run around all in the backyard. They weren't backyards, they were just big garages, and all the kids were running. There weren't any parents, we just ran around. And one day, somebody had a teddy bear, and they exploded it right in the garage, and it was a big fire, and I ran home so fast. The next day I woke up, I wasn't in Boston anymore. I woke up in the suburbs. We didn't know it then, but it was called redlining. And we found out since that the realtors and bankers got together and they found a way to force communities out. So people in Boston, we were living in an integrated community, but we were told to get out, and we all moved to the suburbs. Well, I missed my friends in Boston. My mother missed her mother because she was around the corner. I missed my dad. And I missed being able to walk places and have something to do. Passing through, sometimes lonely, sometimes blue. We're all strangers and we're only passing through. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like Ann Barish to come up.
I am so delighted to be here. And I remember when we first started this, that was 4 years ago. And so many of us are still here fighting the good fight. My story is called My First Visit to a Foreign Country. I want you to imagine, go back in time with me. I am 12 years old, full of energy, with antennae out to here. I know the score. And even though my family tries to shield me from their constant arguing and sadness, I pick everything up. I am in our dining room that has candlesticks and pictures of people I will never meet. Per usual, my parents are arguing, fighting, and crying in their bedroom. My mother comes out, and it's clear she has been crying. She says, "Annie, this summer you will be staying with Dad's brother and his wife. You will have fun, I am sure." Thus, in one day, my 12-year-old self is whisked away from the gray emptiness and sad loneliness of upper-class Connecticut to relatives I barely know. A place of technicolor, noise, and lots of kids. This is the foreign country of Brooklyn, New York. My routine is established. My aunt teaches me how to make a bed, how to sort the laundry, and how to get things ready for dinner. Like my mother, my aunt has candles and pictures of relatives in her front room. Despite my innate curiosity and my tendency to provoke, I know not to ask about them. After the apartment has been tidied up, we go out to shop. I am allowed to maneuver the grocery laundry cart down the street to the fruit and vegetable stands that are outside on the main street. We go to stalls that have clothes and other things for the house. On several visits to a special stand, I see a pink leatherette jacket that I think is divine. I pointed out to my aunt, and she nods. I am genuinely surprised, therefore, when my aunt takes my request seriously and engages in long discussions with the man who owns the stall. They talk in a strange language, the same language my parents use when they don't want me to understand. They yell at each other and they laugh. Finally, the man stands up with difficulty, slaps his hand, and reaches up for the jacket. When he extends his arm, I see numbers, markings on the inside of his arm. He looks at me, says something in that language, and growls at me to mind my own business. My aunt responds, leave her alone, she doesn't know. And she pulls my hand to go away. After lunch of rye bread and salami, I am released from my responsibilities and go outside to play with my newfound friends. This is a treat. My pals are Arlene and Sarah. We are unsupervised, and I soon learn I have certain talents that I can parlay into leadership and power positions. I am good at jacks, and I can beat the experts. I am quick on my feet and learn the various jump rope games that are the hardest to learn. I am reckless and drift to the boys' games. When the older boys goad me into bicycle games, I call their bluff and join in. I put on clunky roller skates, hold on to the backs of their bikes, and go down Flatbush Avenue. I hold on until the boys holler, now! My fearlessness impresses the boy and gives me street cred with the girls. When my aunt asks how I spent the day, I learn to be upbeat, smile, and be strategically vague, and pepper my tales with an appropriate number of facts that are a grand combination of lies and smiles. My trusting aunt and her friends spend their afternoons watching stories. They gather outside on the stoop to gossip and share recipes. The women open up to my aunt. I can tell they trust and like her. Every now and then, a woman named Hannah comes to visit my aunt. She dresses in black and white fussy suits. She always wears a hat. And no matter how hot it is, she dresses up to her neck. I hate her. I don't know why. She is covered in a veil of perpetual sadness. She scares me. She is thin and pale. When she comes, the women on the stoop make room for her. They stop talking and lower their voices. Hello, Hannah, how are you? They ask. Hannah does not know what to say, but tries to be polite. She giggles and tries to answer half in English and half in that other language. She nods and smiles and runs up the stairs to my aunt, who has stood up and is opening the door for her. When she visits with my aunt, they eat cookies in the breakfast nook. The cookies come from a special blue tin on top of my aunt's refrigerator. This is the one thing in the kitchen that I am not allowed to touch. Even though it's summer, they drink hot tea. Hannah drinks and eats, and my aunt pats her arm. Per usual, they speak in that strange language. When Hannah comes, it is understood that I must leave the apartment and my gentle and soft-spoken aunt makes it clear that I am not to return anytime soon. But feeling both ignored and curious, I sneak back into the apartment to eavesdrop. One day, I am really bold. I swing into the kitchen, steal a cookie from the tin, and tease Hannah, who begins to shake when I startle her. Having been brought up in a house of secrets, fears, shouting, and tears, I am an expert at sneaking out vulnerability, and Hannah sure fits the bill. I go up behind Hannah, pull up her sleeve, and shout, "What you got up there? Are they Mr. Smith's winning numbers?" She pulls down her sleeve, starts to tear up, tells me that the number is her telephone number, and to mind my own business. My aunt is horrified, and the first time I've known her, she yells at me as I run giggling down the step. I am triumphant. I've been noticed. I am a force to be dealt with. The next time she comes, I am prepared. I have stolen my aunt's laundry pen and have written my telephone number on my wrist, the inside of my arm. Since Sarah, Arlene, and the other kids are always up for a little mischief, they agree to write their telephone numbers on the inside of their arms. On my lead, my crew bursts into the apartment and begins to show off our recently drawn telephone numbers. Overwhelmed by our size, our noise, and the chaos we create, Hannah begins to shriek, shake, and cry. My aunt yells at us and sends us out of the apartment, screaming that we are a pack of lunatics and Meshuggahs. Sarah, Arlene, and I dash down the steps of the apartment, hence we are giddy with triumph. My heart is pounding, I can barely breathe. Sarah settles onto the last step of the stoop. Arlene sits on the first. I collapse somewhere in the middle. Sarah tries to lick off her numbers, and when that doesn't work, she takes her shirt to finish the job. When that does not work, she thinks it's time to leave. She jumps up and says to Noah, "I gotta go home." Always the dramatic one, Arlene announces to Noah, "Boy, was that a lot of noise." She too gets up and leaves. She does not do anything. In the past, she would pat me on the head and say, "Night, night, buddy." I put my head in my lap. I feel empty. I want to throw up. I look up and I see that the neighborhood has changed. It is dinner time. The sky is beginning to darken. The men are coming home from work. It is very quiet. I am trembling, and the new feeling of being in control, a leader and an outlaw, has vanished and has been replaced with a wrenching fear and shame. My aunt comes down the steps with her arms around Hannah. Hannah is weeping and collapsing into my aunt's shoulder. My aunt stops next to me, hits me, and says, "Give." I put the pen in her hand. My aunt ushers Hannah down the steps. Without turning her head, my aunt announces, "I am walking Hannah home. I expect the table to be set when I come home." She then turns and faces me. She puts her hands on her hips and says, "You know what? I'll start dinner. You take Hannah home." I stand up and I walk towards Hannah. I take her limp hand. Her head is down and she continues to whimper. I turn her around and we silently walk towards her apartment 4 blocks away. That night, we have a very quiet evening. In the morning, my father is standing in the middle of his brother's kitchen. He is furious. He slams my clothes into a suitcase and takes me to the car. When I am there, he turns to me and snarls, "We will never, ever talk about this again." As I grow into adulthood, I often thought of my first visit to a foreign country, Brooklyn, New York. I remember the street games, the freedom, and my friends with delight. I also thought of the many zombies who had numbers on their arms and what this all meant. And most of all, I thought of Hannah. When I became an adult, I began to piece together what I had seen and experienced. I decided to become a history teacher. And as a history teacher, I would never engage in secrets that were designed to protect children from the truth. I would champion the idea of making the cruelty of mankind, in particular the Holocaust, a hallmark of my teaching. I promised to teach in such a way that all children could ask difficult questions without feeling shamed or shut down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And next, I'd like to call up Shirelle Cantor.
We are in some extraordinarily difficult times. I don't think that needs belaboring. Songs are one way that we bring ourselves together and we raise and strengthen our spirits. And this is a song that was born from acts and another time of protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline 9 years ago now, written by Batya Levine and Noam Lerman. And it's called We Rise. And you'll find the words to the chorus are printed in your programs, and we hope that you'll sing with us. We rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer.
Thank you, thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Judy Schlesinger.
May 2003. My husband of almost 22 years died. He was most likely one of those million-dollar patients, end-stage heart failure, a pump implanted in his heart, and finally, a heart transplant. Many weeks, not days, in the hospital. After his transplant, he was hospitalized again and again and again, more complications, and he died in 2003. Why am I telling you this on highest weekend? Because my husband and my family were privileged and fortunate to have health insurance through our employers, affordable insurance. But our newest neighbors, many undocumented, have nothing. A little over a year later, in 2004, the opening of the Metro West free medical program was announced at High Holiday Services, right here. This program, envisioned and begun by a dedicated group of Bethel, would provide free healthcare services to people without health insurance. I knew I could help. I liked working in a medical environment. I did not think a lot about immigrants other than the chance to use my Spanish and interpret, because they anticipated that a few of the patients would not be English speakers. I certainly was not thinking of the big picture, our American healthcare system, and who is excluded. I volunteered immediately. The clinic's mission was to be an entry point to the healthcare system, keep people out of emergency rooms, and then help them find a more permanent medical home. We also hope that future federally funded health clinics would be established and that we would no longer be needed. We opened and found that most of the patients were undocumented immigrants, and they had no place else to go. Today, limited mass health available to many people, including those in the immigrant community, is not accepted by many physicians. The federally funded community health centers are stretched beyond capacity and generally unable to accept new patients without a very long wait. What had started for me as a way to help people who needed a doctor and use my Spanish made me acutely aware of the injustices and weaknesses of our healthcare system for everyone. And volunteering also opened my eyes to the difficult conditions for the new immigrant community, not just obtaining health care, but finding housing, enrolling in the schools, getting food and clothing, and finding work. If you don't have a job and a good health plan, or if you're not wealthy, your health is at risk. People did and still do not realize that preventative care and general health care for everyone, whether native-born or undocumented immigrant, keeps the entire population healthier. This is so important, healthier. As a volunteer, I learned that we all need to advocate for change. The clinic pushed for Romney's health care plan, the precursor to the Affordable Care Act, and we later pushed to prevent Trump's first administration from changing a law called the Public Charge, which would prevent immigrants from a path to citizenship or a green card if they took advantage of any programs like SNAP, child care, rental assistance, or possibly even health care. People were afraid. Back in 2006, Massachusetts became the first state in the nation to offer a sort of universal health care system. It was limited, but it was a start, and this was Romney Care. We enrolled as many people as we could in mass health. Immigrants could often be approved for emergency room care and nothing else, so we enrolled them. We also directed as many as we could to more permanent federally funded healthcare clinics like Edward Kennedy in Framingham and some of the other towns. But the wait was very, very long to be seen, and those that we referred there kept returning to us for months while they were waiting to be seen. Still, we kept people out of the ER. Initially, we hoped to not be needed in 5 years, then 10 years, and then we realized that our American healthcare system would not be taking care of immigrants or anyone with a limited income for a long, long time. We were needed, and we still are. We are open to anyone with no insurance, but over the years, the vast majority have been immigrants, many of them undocumented. 20 years later, the program is continuing to see patients. Now we're in Marlborough. Sadly, COVID put an end to seeing patients here in this sanctuary. The few government-sponsored clinics in the area are still overflowing. The wait lists are months long. Insurance companies, drug companies, for-profit hospital corporations, they are not going to do anything unless we push for change. In the United States, healthcare is a business, and the bottom line and the shareholders come first, not patients, not the population. We need to change our healthcare system. Part of that change includes ensuring that the undocumented population is healthy too. That helps keep the rest of the population healthy. And we cannot underestimate the importance of community health and well-being. The Metro West Free Medical Program's still here, and we do need funding to continue. I have no doubt that today fears about accessing health care will rise again. Please remember, health care is a human right.
Thank you, Judy. And even though the clinic's not hosted here anymore, we know that many Bethel members like yourself and like Gary Hirsch are still very active in the clinic. So it's wonderful to have that connection still. Next, I'd like to call up Colin Thomas.
So I wanted to start by saying thank you to the congregation for being so welcoming to my family. We're new here, strangers in your midst, and you've provided a good home for us. So I grew up in El Paso, Texas, where my family resided for just over 120 years. The home in which I was raised was bilingual and culturally a mix of Mexican Catholicism and mayonnaise-eating Protestantism, but the house itself was adobe. My first language was Spanish, and my culture musically, culinarily, and emotionally was Mexican. I spent my boyhood and young adulthood wandering the Tularosa Basin, which you may know for the White Sands National Monument. Interestingly, this Graben Valley, where I first fell in love with biology, collecting fossils and cacti and lizards and lichens and tarantulas and scorpions, and during August monsoon season, spadefoot toads and protozoans. It's also where I fell in love with the idea that most of my teachers and nearly all of my friends had an ancestral claim to this land, whereas I didn't. Texas and the Gadsden Purchase were both land grabs, one violent and the other less so. And my family had been involved directly with the European colonization of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. My great-uncle Gus came into the property that my aunt now owns in Arizona while he homesteaded it as a territory. It was a condition that he attempt to at least grow one crop and shoot any Apaches that he saw on site. It was during my family's incursion into the American West, after the Civil War, but before the Spanish-American War, that the southern border was finally decided, but almost unilaterally. It only had meaning at the time to people in Washington or people who lived elsewhere and thought much of borders, never actually having lived on one. Much, much later, for me and millions of others in the 1970s and 1980s, El Paso was actually El Paso Juarez. We moved freely across the border, as most of us had family and friends who were both El Pasoans and Juarezans. My teachers, in order from kindergarten to sixth grade, Gonzalez, Macana, Alvarez, Armignac, Ramirez, and Villalba, were all first-generation immigrants. They were women who came with their parents to El Paso and went to UTEP to garner undergraduate as well as graduate degrees, and settled into the population in the El Paso Public or Isleta Public Schools, which was 80% Hispanic. My formative experiences in high school were from teachers whose parents could not speak English when they arrived. Olga Torres and Eva Cantu placed me squarely on a trajectory for college when I wanted to become a stonemason. Mrs. Cantu, who learned English from golden books her migrant worker father brought her at a supermarket, eventually obtained a master's degree in chemistry and was to create the first science club at my high school, integral to my ability to later earn a PhD. These people, my teachers, are representative of the types of people who came across the border with their children. They are intrepid, curious, learning-centered, and stranger-loving people. Very Jewish, but not Jews. But this land is theirs. It was their ancestors who came across Beringia and arrived to what we now know to be the oldest human population in North or South America. There, where I caught my first collared lizards, on the ancient shores of a Pleistocene lake, Lake Otero, are the footprints of their ancestors, most assuredly, where the mineralized Murray footprint impressions of 10 to 15 teenagers suggest dancing on a shore where giant sloths and mastodons came to drink. The first humans known in North or South America were having children who wandered the Tularosa Basin 25,000 years before my ancestors arrived to wall their continent in and prosecute their transiting descendants by force of arms or ice patrols. It seems somewhat out of order, because if we as Jews lay claim to Eretz Israel, based on the archaeological evidence from the time of David, then what can be said of a people who have a similar claim to this continent and its sister? Their claim being 22,000 years older. Who really is the trespasser? And who is the stranger?
Thank you. And we're so thrilled that you and your family are members here at Bethel. Next, I would love to call up, I'm honored and thrilled to call up the chair of our Sanctuary Committee, Carl.
A couple of months ago, Catherine Clark, our representative in Congress and the number 2 Democrat in the House of Representatives, spent well over an hour at Casa, the Metro West Worker Center in Framingham, at a meeting organized to have her hear mainly from immigrants, but also from some organizations Casa was working with. And of course, as a leading member in Congress, Representative Clark is focused on what she can do to affect our government's immigration policy. Most of the people there were, in fact, immigrants. One was a minister of a Hispanic Protestant congregation in Framingham, and a few of us were from friendly organizations. There was a representative of the Needham Immigration Task Force. There was a member of the Quaker Meeting House in Framingham, and Judy Sletzinger and I were there representing our Sanctuary Committee. Everyone got a chance to speak. When I spoke, I said that we at Bethel work with people who are fleeing to our country in fear for their lives. I think I mentioned the Ayalas as an example. And I said that the success rate for their appeals is abysmal. At that point, Catherine Clark looked straight at me with an intense look and nodded. She's thinking about this. After that, I said a bit about why we do this. I said that for me, there are 2 reasons. The first reason is personal. My father's side of the family all came to this country a little over 100 years ago. They came from Eastern Europe, they somehow made their way to Canada, and they ultimately just walked over the border. They were never referred to as illegal aliens. The second reason is religious. Our Bible is full of commandments, not just what people think of as the 10 Commandments. There are hundreds more. One of them is more often repeated in the Bible than any other, by far. It is the commandment to look out for the immigrant and refugee. It's repeated 36 times. This is really remarkable. Honor your father and mother is there twice. Taking care of the immigrant and refugee. It's there 36 times. It's hysterical in a way, right? Catherine Clark was really focused. She was writing this all down as I was speaking. She didn't really have to do that herself. She was there with 3 of her aides. But she did, and she was clearly very serious about it. Several people mentioned to me that when I got to the part about the 36 repetitions of the commandment, they noticed that she was particularly intense. Afterwards, the woman from the Quaker congregation made a point of telling me that she was really impressed by what I had said about the Bible, and she was going to bring it back and tell people about it. The minister, who I had not been introduced to, made a point of shaking my hand as he left. So my takeaway is that I was speaking in a language that was meaningful to these people as it is to us. And that was my role at the meeting. Now, finally, and I'm really surprised that it took me so many years to even think about this question, why is it that this commandment is repeated so much more than the others? Is this because looking out for immigrants and refugees is so much more important than honoring your parents? No, I don't think that's the reason. Certainly, at least part of the reason is that honoring your parents is something we are brought up with and that in some sense is baked into us. We could hardly have survived as a species without honoring our parents. But my guess is that looking out for immigrants and refugees was just as controversial in biblical times as it is today. And so that's why such a central and repeated point is made of this in the Torah. It was never a completely obvious point. It was always something that was up for grabs and probably often avoided or talked about only uncomfortably and watered down. And the fact that it is hammered on so hard in the Torah really says something about our history and values. So it's quite understandable that, just as was true 3,000 years ago, we need to keep talking about it. But it also is something that we can say really is part of our history, part of who we are, a practice we can be proud of, as well as something we very much need to keep doing and talking about publicly, especially in the current political atmosphere. And if our ancestors could do it, so can we. And finally, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Gina Lamott, who Gina Lamott, who was here in the room where it happened when the Sanctuary Project in this congregation started up before many of us were born, as a matter of fact. I think that's fair to say. And she was the leader, the main leader of it for quite some time. And so she's going to talk to you about some of the remarkable things that she and we did at the time and the reasons that we were impelled to do them. And those reasons are just as alive today as they were then.
Can you hear me? I don't care what they say. They say comedy is hard. Comedy is not hard. Serious is hard. I don't think most, maybe no one in this story, in this room has heard this. I spent a fair amount of time, and continue to do so in my town government, and have been asked, why aren't you afraid to stand up there and open up your big mouth and advocate and speak your mind? And if they have the time, I tell them this story. It's spring of 1985, and during announcements, Rabbi Emeritus Lawrence Kushner mentioned that he had heard something about the sanctuary movement and asked that somebody look into it. I was one of a small committee that took leadership, and in May of 1987, Bethel declared sanctuary. And some of those same people are still hard at work on sanctuary 40 years later. Okay. October of 1987. I'm detained with 3 other Interfaith Coalition activists in a small room at a military base in rural El Salvador. We were attempting to get to one of the most dangerous regions, Chalatenango, during a time of civil war, death squads, a militarized repressive government, no human rights, and an oligarchic economy. We were well aware that in 1980, a paramilitary squad, death squad, had murdered 4 American nuns and assassinated Archbishop Oscar Romero as he was presiding at a memorial mass. Neither our American citizenship nor religious status would be a bulletproof shield. We nervously joked about which one of us they would hate the most. The Catholics for being commie Christians, or the Jews, well, just for being Jews. Vatican Council absolvement of the 1960s hadn't quite taken hold there yet. We prayed together for courage. We prayed for God's protection, and with humility, we prayed that none of us would have to ask to use the bathroom, because we had been there for over 6 hours already. Early that morning, we had set out to visit a village that was being rebuilt by refugees from the Mesa Grande refugee camp in Honduras. They had returned in September in a massive self-directed voluntary repatriation. I had visited the camp in August to record testimony and document the situation for our work in the accompaniment movement. Many we had met were survivors of the Simple River Massacre of 1980, which happened when people fleeing the violence of a military offensive against area rebel activity were attacked by the Honduran military as they crossed the river seeking refuge. Hundreds of people had been murdered, and now the survivors were home. My suitcase was packed with greeting cards of art made by school children from Boston and Cambridge. Tough one, okay. The president of the NGO Human Rights Commission of El Salvador, Herbert Anaya, had been assassinated a day or 2 before we left the US. Immediately upon our arrival in San Salvador, while driving into the city on the same road where the American nuns had been brutally raped and murdered, we were told that one of our first assignments was to be part of the honor guard for the family at the funeral. Church, long procession through the streets, cemetery, and we were to stick like glue. Because even though our US citizenship was not a 100% guarantee of safety, the risk of harm to us was small compared to that facing the Salvadorans, and we did not hesitate or question, because accompaniment was why we were there. We surrounded the family at the funeral in the Metropolitan Cathedral in front of several thousand mourners and what seemed like as many military, police, and masked paramilitary forces inside and out. The heavily cloying scent of candles and flowers turned to that of acridly burning tires and cars along the streets filled with thousands more who had come to witness, mourn, and protest. Our guide warned us that the black Jeep Cherokees were police and military, and the white ones were the death squad vehicles. As we marched a mile in the stifling heat to the cemetery, we never left the family. Several of the photos I took are of 25-year-old Phoebe Velasquez, speaking passionately about continuing the fight for rights and justice. And almost exactly 2 years later to the day, she was one of 9 killed in a bombing of the National Federation of Union headquarters on October 31st of 1989. We feared that the Army outpost unit holding us had been informed of our presence at the funeral. A letter of credentials from Senator Ted Kennedy was our one amulet. But when I showed it to the garrison commander, he grabbed it out of my hands and began to read it upside down. Long after nightfall, it was concluded that we weren't a cell of gringo guerrilla, and they let us go. We were more successful the next day and made it to one of the other conflicted zone settlements, where we were reunited with the people whose testimony we had recorded. And a village council leader proudly showed me the place of honor where the high necklace that I had taken off months earlier and given to him was now proudly displayed. So, what I really want to talk to you about, that's just a story. How does a person go from responding to a rabbi's casual request to being held against my will by the Salvadoran military in the middle of a civil war? How does the narrative change from welcoming the stranger with comfort to immersion in political activity? It is when you ask why. Why did they come? And what part does my government have in their suffering here and in their countries of origin, that the need for direct political activity becomes clear? Now, the Reagan administration was going after some of the southwest border churches, but even those of us who were very definitely breaking the law didn't worry too much. Nor did it seem likely that Bethel would be a target for an attack on our tax-exempt status. The feds were too busy in Boston and Cambridge to bother with the suburbs. But times have changed, and it is now abhorrently apparent that the current government will be delighted to attack sanctuary states, municipalities, and yes, traditional places of sanctuary like hospitals and schools and churches. And just because they didn't actually say the word synagogue, I don't know if we should be insulted that they actually, that's not going to get us off the hook, okay? Where was I? Okay. It would be presumptuous of me to say that I have the answers. Everybody wants to know what to do? I don't have the answers. Everybody present today is already invested in the work of fulfilling the commandment to welcome the stranger, because we are all in this together. At one time, there were a number of very active sanctuary cities, towns, and churches and synagogues throughout the nation, and many of them were in New England. Sanctuary-specific coalitions are essential, and if no longer active, particularly in the interfaith community, we have to revive them. So at 32, I had a youthful disregard for danger. I was whistling in the dark. At 71, well, frankly, taking on the autocracy was not on my retirement bucket list. Yet, here I am. God help me, I have a grandchild. Hineni. Got more, almost done, I promise. And it is necessary in this urgent, if not now, when time, that we reflect personally upon the level of risk one is willing to take. As members of Bethel, as a sanctuary committee, pledge to welcome and protect undocumented migrants, we must ask ourselves, do we fulfill that commitment, and to what extent? Because, and I'm going to actually lean forward, how do we respond when it is our turn to take in Anne Frank? There are no right or wrong answers, because no judgments. We have to ask the questions, and we have to have the conversations with ourselves and with one another. Now, this is not a fire drill. This is now, and it is history. As a member, I want to tone it down, because as a member of the board of directors, which I wasn't in 1985, that didn't happen until 1986. They saw a volunteer and they grabbed me. Sight unseen, uncredentialed. As a member of the board of directors, I undertook a great responsibility for the well-being of the congregation as a religious institution, and to every member of the community, the staff and the clergy. Planning and preparing for what could occur as a result of our collective activism is imperative. Anything from driving someone to an appointment to housing them in our coll could be cause for serious legal violations. So much is unknown, it is not unreasonable to prepare for worst-case scenarios. So with that in mind, I brought it up at a December board meeting, and I felt responsible to put it on the radar, and they contacted Carl Offner, and he asked me to speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And next, I would love to call up Kath Bean and again Judy Schlesinger for some remarks.
First of all, it is wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming. We have listened to poetry and we've listened to stories on human kindness. Who isn't a stranger? First trip to a foreign country, health care as a human right, borders, talking with ourselves, others, and Congresswoman Clark. And finally from Gina, if not now, when? Here is another story, a proverb, or in Hebrew, mashal. A group of villagers notice a baby in a basket floating down a river, and they rescue that baby. Over time, more are coming down, floating down the river, and the villagers start taking them out, until finally one villager says, "You stay, and I will go upriver to see why they're being put into the river." For years, Bethel has followed the commandment to be kind to the stranger, the ger, the refugee, to provide help for today and to figure out and address the why, so that in the days and years to come, refugees will be able to come to our country to find safety, welcome, compassion, and kindness as they become our neighbors. As well as taking in and helping to settle immigrant families, we have collected clothing for CJP families, gathered signatures for health care reform in Massachusetts, turned out for Sudbury's town meeting to pass the Welcoming Town resolution, and more recently, we've been driving Casa clients to court appointments. And we sat with the young Casa family during their expedited removal hearings. Fortunately, and to our great relief, after the hearing, the immigration judge reversed the order for immediate deportation, and the young family could then enter the asylum process. We acknowledge that our values are reflected in the actions taken by our local, state, and federal officials. These actions are directed by regulations, policies, laws, and now by our President's executive orders. We do this holy work within community, each of us joining with others as we meet the commandment to be kind to the stranger in our midst. We're going to read a poem.
I'm her helper.
We are like the clouds. We are like the clouds. We are like the wind. We are like the butterflies. We are like the rivers. We are like the ocean.
Somos como las nubes. Somos como las nubes. Somos como el viento. Somos como las mariposas. Somos como los ríos. Somos como el mar.
Thank you, Kath and Judy, both for that and for all you have been doing for so many years. Thank you to we're not done yet, folks, but I just have to take this moment to thank the entire Sanctuary Committee for decades of powerful and effective and inspiring work. I'll also take this moment before calling up Diego and Aaron of Casa to thank our clergy, Rabbi Josh and Cantor Vera, for not only inspiring us, but also for doing so much, both for immigrants and more broadly for social justice. We owe you so much, and you continue to inspire us with both your words and your actions, so thank you. Now, without any further ado, let me call up Diego Lo and Naren from Casa. We have been so fortunate to partner with you over the years. You impress us, inspire us so much because of your work one-on-one with families and workers, and also the way that you work with legislators and help to influence the way that policy happens in our state. So it's been just a privilege to partner with you as Bethel. Thank you. Please come teach us how to take action.
This past Wednesday, should I raise this up? Thank you. Thank you. So this past Wednesday evening, a message began to circulate in the form of a public service announcement, for lack of a better term. And it was within the immigrant community, a warning of a massive ICE operation to take place the following day on the 30th. The messages were saying things like there would be roadblocks on major roads, people detecting drones coming through the streets, and more frightening than ever perhaps was cautioning immigrants to stay home from work, suggesting that they shouldn't even send their kids to school. The announcement actually cites the Department of Immigrant Protection, a government agency that never has and does not exist. It proved a source of disinformation, actually, intended to sow fear and panic within the community. Casa and our local legal services organization actually worked on a joint statement which could then be sent in the same way over social media and WhatsApp to debunk this disinformation. So We realized on Friday, actually, at the second of 2 days of a legal conference for worker centers, gathering actually from all over the country, that this malicious attempt at sowing fear amongst the community was, locally, it was actually a statewide, it percolated on a statewide level in Massachusetts after speaking with some partners at a worker center in Springfield, talking with partners in Boston. Unfortunately, this wasn't exactly the first, you could say maybe digital attack of this nature, and it probably won't be the last. There are those out there who are deliberately trying to instill fear into the hearts of our immigrant neighbors, in addition to the unjust policy that forms as a kind of state violence against our community members. At that conference I mentioned yesterday and on Friday, while much of it was focused on developing the relationship between legal partners and dedicated lawyers with the community organizers and worker leaders at worker centers like Casa, a very powerful workshop for me was the opportunity of discussing what community safety looks like in this day and age for worker centers and similar immigrant-led organizations. Unfortunately, as is the case with many houses of worship, especially as I've talked to many Jewish friends within the Jewish community, there's this constant thought of how do we protect us? How do we keep us safe? Whether it's in the context now of protecting our immigrant friends, neighbors, and our Casa families, it can be now to responding to the way that policies are changing under the new Trump administration in just the last 2 weeks, like the sensitive policies pertaining to ICE policy that was mentioned earlier. And so there's all sorts of responses to this, right? Whether it's designating public and private space. This last week, we completely reorganized the Casa office to deliberately adapt to this current moment, right? It goes on, to considerations about how we protect information, personally identifying information of our membership lists, of clients for Mass Health who we are helping to connect with the free medical program or Edward Community Health, to thinking about what it means to convene our worker leadership and community members at community events in the future, what we can and can't put on social media, and what our worker council is thinking in terms of, preparing for the worst, preparing for disruptors, preparing for immigration to show up at one of our events. So I think in this moment where there's so much going on for us as a worker center, where we're constantly thinking about how we organize not just individuals, but families and workers across industries, right? How we're addressing healthcare inequities, and now how we are helping, above all, to kind of keep lifting up the voice of immigrant workers, leaders who are reminding the community that there is still hope, that there is still a need for us to keep doing the work that we're doing, and that we can't sort of live in fear, right? I think what stood out to me is that more important than ever, in addition to kind of the professional connections we're having as a worker center, are the connections we have with folks like you in faith communities, in other allied communities, because it's those connections that we're seeing, from my perspective, give hope to the families who are fighting expedited removal, to the families who are in most jeopardy at this current time. And I think about often after having met with families, we often receive a lot of thanks and acknowledgement for the work that staff and the worker center is able to do, and the allies. But I also think how a lot of our immigrant folks who come through the worker center also say, primero Dios, right? First, thanks to God. And I think it's just really heartening to think that as a faith community at Bethel, we continue to think about ways in which we're responding to this current moment. So I want to turn things over to Diego to address a little bit more how we continue to move this energy and the incredible work that so many of you have done for many years.
I don't feel particularly gathered in my thoughts. It's a moment when one is really wrestling with how to understand the moment and to figure out how we respond. I guess I want to start by sharing the prayer that we will help build a world where people don't have to migrate, which is not only so far from our current moment, but also would require us to turn our world upside down in terms of the wealth that we've accumulated here that needs to be back in home communities so that people can build lives for themselves and for their children. There's a restaurant not in between our office and this, almost literally on the path. There are a few people there from the town of Bule in Huehuetenango. For me, that's a significant place, although it's not very big, because in the early 90s, I was a translator for a young Chu man. Chu is the language of Bule, who had been forced at gunpoint to help execute other family members and neighbors by the military. And had, you wonder why he'd had to do it, except that he had already helped bury another Chu village that had been completely wiped out. And so, you do what you're told to do. And that it sort of weaves my life together that here are these two young Chu people working for $7 an hour, no overtime, 68 hours a week. It's been under investigation for more than 5 years, and they still have not. It still hasn't come to a resolution, and that's sort of the arc of this thing we're talking about. The executive orders that have been announced have various, can sort of be clumped together in terms of what their effect is. And one of them that is sort of out of our immediate sight line is the fact that they will close the border. They will close the borders down, and that means that that folks like the Ayalas and others will, in 2025, will not be able to get here. I mean, it's going to close it down between military and remain in Mexico and whatever else. The two biggest groups in our area, I think, in terms of just the blunt, brute impact of those orders, are going to be those who came in on parole. A lot of the Haitians and Venezuelans who are in our communities came in doing exactly as they were told to do. They applied with the CBP One app They and have, you know, are here with 2-year parole. That has been already sunsetted. And although I don't think they will be the first ones they will go after, it's clear that they will be deported. I mean, that's on paper. The ones that Casa is particularly focused on are the folks who you all have met, in those of you who have accompanied us and them, who will have to prove that they've been here for 2 years in order not to be subject to sort of instant deportation without appeal. No going before a judge. Expedited removal is at the hands of someone, you know, any of the ICE officers or other DEA agents or others that are being deputized to join them can make an on-the-spot decision that somebody is deportable. You know, whether they'll build any safeguards into that, we don't know, but they're not required to. They are, which means in practical terms that we have to help people document that they've been here for 2 years if they have. So if you've been living as precariously as many people are, you know, sleeping the whole family in the living room of a 2-bedroom apartment and there are 4 families in it, what are the chances that you still have that documentation? So one of the things we can do is bring cookies and muffins and join Casa's hubbub to help people, you know, call the court and get a copy of that traffic ticket, or go over to the Metro West Medical Center and get documentation of their ER visit 2.5 years prior. If they don't have it on them, they probably won't get a chance to produce it. So we have to obtain that documentation and make multiple copies of it for people to fold up and put in their pocket and then replace when it gets too worn to carry further. That's sort of the obvious edge. People who've been here, who are in court, who are applying for asylum, if they didn't apply for it in the first year they came, can have their cases terminated and they can be put in expedited removal. So in that interval between the first and the second year. That's those between the folks who are having their parole stripped away, which is to say basically the sheltered families, and this huge population of folks who now, you know, can be picked up. And we had the experience this week of taking somebody into to the Burlington office and walking in sort of with our hearts in our throat because we didn't really expect him to come back out. And the good news is that the office doesn't seem to yet have got the, you know, they don't have change, there hasn't been a change of the guard quite yet. But I think the same visit a few weeks from now is probably going to have a very different result. And I think that's just the beginning. Excuse my being grim, but there will be people detained in school parking lots and maybe in emergency rooms and whatever, because they have very carefully and explicitly said that those are no longer out of bounds. I don't know how to change gears at that moment and say, Casa has, I'll speak for myself personally as well as the Casa members who have found our spirits lifted by your smiles and your cookies and your good cheer when you have joined us, and ask you not to, I know you will not fade away, but that you will, despite our lack of organization at times, make your way to our door and join us, join the community. And you have meant a lot to us, and it means a lot that we know you're going to face it with us.